Hi all, it's Mrs. Baranyk here to finish out the classical era with the Americas. When most people think about the classical era and its golden ages like those of the Han Dynasty in China or the Gupta Dynasty in South Asia or the Roman Empire, they don't usually include the Americas. Most people's knowledge of the Americas starts with maybe the Aztecs and the Inca and then swiftly moves on to the invasion of Europeans who took over starting in the 15th century. But there were rich, thriving societies in the Americas long before any of these. Let's start in Mesoamerica, which refers to Mexico and Central America. The Mayan civilization was centered in present-day Guatemala, the Yucatan Peninsula, Belize, and parts of Honduras, Mexico, and El Salvador. The earliest Mayan settlements go back to 1800 BCE. They were an agricultural people who grew corn, beans, squash, and cassava, and they were probably the first group to discover the wonders of chocolate. They seem to have borrowed culturally from another early group, the Olmec, who are mostly known because of the giant stone heads they left behind. Culturally, the Mayans had a written language, even writing books on birch bark. Birch bark paper scrolls were also used in South Asia by early Buddhists. Several of these Mayan books have survived and can be found in museums around the world. The golden age of Mayan culture was from around 250 CE to 900 CE. By this time, there were about 40 known cities, some which may sound familiar to you: Tikal, Copan, Palenque, etc. And the populations of these cities range from 5,000 to 50,000, and at their peak, the total population of the Mayans was about 2 million people. The Mayans are well known for their monumental architecture, especially their plazas, palaces, temples, and step pyramids, which were highly decorated. They also built a ton of these stone courts for a game that they played with a hard rubber ball. Rubber balls in the Americas date back to about 1600 BCE, but Europeans didn't know about them until they found the Americas and found them in the 16th century. In this dangerous game, anything but hands could touch the ball, and the ball was hard. Sometimes players died on the court after getting smacked in the organs. Occasionally, the game was played as part of a religious ritual that ended with the losers being sacrificed. So let's talk about religion. As I mentioned with their game, there is evidence that the Maya practiced human sacrifice. This was a pretty common phenomenon in Mesoamerica, and like most Mesoamerican cultures, the Mayans were also polytheistic. There were so many gods that rituals happened often and usually involved bloodletting, where a priest cuts himself and offers some of his own blood rather than human sacrifice. As with many groups who are focused on the heavens, the Mayans are also known for their advanced astronomy and mathematics. They used zero like the Gupta dynasty and developed a complex calendar based on a 365-day year, as well as another calendar that lasted for over 5,000 years. The Mayans engaged in a lot of trade through their expansive region, and luxury goods like jade and obsidian were traded further distances into Mexico and into the Caribbean islands. Their society was hierarchical, with a king at the top who was believed to be related to the gods. A woman could only rule if her husband died and her son was too young to rule, but there were some very powerful women leaders among the Mayans. The leader was believed to be able to intervene with the gods on behalf of his people. However, the Mayans were mostly decentralized, and each city-state seems to have had their own ruling family. Priests were also important in the social hierarchy. They don't seem to have had a standing army, but we know they engaged in warfare. Something else that I find fascinating about the Maya is that scholars think that from one early Mayan language, many others developed. In modern-day Mexico and Central America, millions of people still speak 70 different Mayan languages. The decline of the Maya started in the late 8th century and continued through the 9th century. By about 900 CE, the Golden Age was over. No one really knows what happened, but it seems to have been tied to climate change. There were two major droughts right around the time of the collapse, and while the Maya had made it through droughts before, it seemed like there were just too many people to survive and thrive, although the Maya did continue to build cities up to the 1500s. I also want to talk about a culture that was not part of Mayan civilization and who thrived before the Aztecs, but whose chief city and much of their culture was eventually adopted by them: Teotihuacan. The city of Teotihuacan is in modern Mexico, about 25 miles from Mexico City, which is about the same distance I commute to Vernon Hills High School from my home. The name means place of the gods in Nahuatl, which was also the language of the later Aztecs, although new research thinks that it might actually have been Teotihuacan, which means city of the sun. Settlement began around 500 BCE, which is around the same time that the Persian Empire has its origins, and from the 2nd century CE to the 7th century CE, it was an important political and religious center. The main city was created on a grid layout, meaning that it was planned, which was really unusual in this time period. Like the Mayans, the monumental architecture of Teotihuacan is outstanding. The Pyramid of the Sun is the third biggest pyramid in the world, following two Egyptian pyramids. They also built temples and government buildings and a kind of apartment complex that was a single story high but that many families lived in. There were about 2,000 of these. Also, like the Mayans, their architecture was covered in sculpture and rich wall paintings. Also, like the Mayans, they traded widely and were mostly known for their obsidian tools, which have been found all over Mesoamerica, and they were also agricultural, growing beans, avocados, peppers, squash. They also raised chickens and turkeys, and this is a good place to mention that most domesticated animals like cows, sheep, and goat are not present in the Americas at this time. Europeans brought them here. And again, like the Mayans, they were polytheistic, and there's evidence of some human sacrifice. Teotihuacan had a form of record keeping done with glyphs or images, but it seems to have been somewhat limited, unlike the Mayan written language. At its peak population, Teotihuacan may have had as many as 200,000 people. The civilization collapsed around 600 CE and major buildings were burned, art and religious artifacts were destroyed, and this seems to indicate some kind of attack, but we don't know if it was a revolt from within or an invasion from outside. So I was going to try to get the Americas done in one video, but there's just too much to say. So join me for video 10 where I'll finish off with some of the Andean peoples of the classical era.